Chapter 5 River Dance. The two lay in the undergrowth for some indeterminate time before Kendra's pounding heart and cold sweat subsided. All the while, the boy bawled chokingly into her collar. She sat up, as still he clung to her chest, his meager weight hardly impeding her as she looked around consideringly. It dawned on her that she had indeed found what she was looking for. That she hadn't really considered this far ahead was now readily apparent. It could not be overlooked that the boy was clearly not normal. Out here, very little was. Few dared to walk this road, and what lived among the dangers of the garden often did so only by being dangerous in its own right. Kendra balked at the notion. Lean, if not quite sickly, and obviously discomposed, he did not seem dangerous. Face still shrouded in darkness, he looked up to her, and he seemed for all the world a lost child stumbling around a crowd for his mother. As he moved, the otherworldly blackness of those eyes caught the reflected moonlight luminously, and she gulped. "What happened? Where is your family?" Gnawing at her lip at the inanity of the question, she tried to determine what to ask, and did not notice the boy's sharp intake of breath, the flash of his eyes. But even distracted, she took notice as he began to sniff her heavily. She blinked, perplexed, a protest in her throat that died on her lips. He was fixing her with the most fervent stare, looking as uncertain as she felt, his nose still buried in the leathers of her coat. Croaking, he rasped a word. "Brother?" Kendra stared back at him, nonplussed. The boy's face was still inclined against clear enough evidence that she was not male. If the situation had been less frightening, she might even have been indignant. The boy had to be in shock, delirious. And it was clear that whatever fear she felt, he felt it at least as strongly. The tremor in her hands steadied. "I could help you find your brother," she offered quietly, voice now roughly soothing. "Now, put this on. You must be freezing." She winced against the cold as she pulled off her coat, only slightly impeded as he clung to her. Averting her eyes from his nude frame, she quickly moved to sling it around his shoulder. He squawked loudly, and they both started as he jerked about in the loose, heavy fabric, evidently alarmed. Attempts to adjust arms into the appropriate holes were quickly abandoned. The jacket was a source of some great confusion and suspicion to him. Eventually, she left it as a sort of loose cloak draped over him, then stood to squint against the darkness for the landmarks that would lead her back to camp. It was fortunate that she hadn't been overly delicate in picking her path, for a clear patch of snapped twigs and shoots pointed her way back. She took a step, only to find that the boy still kneeled, looking up to her. With an attempt at a reassuring smile, she extended a hand back to him. After several moments, he took it. Spinning thoughts crinkled Kendra's brow. Moira would not take this guest well. She could not imagine arguing the caravan mistress into acceptance. Frankly, she hardly could make such an argument to herself. The long, cool fingers in her grasp betrayed a surprising strength as he trailed behind her. His steps were shuffling, graceless, and every so often she all but caught him and set him back on his floundering feet as he stumbled among the brambles and underbrush. The forest floor had to be tearing his feet apart, but he was mute, save for periodic sniffs that still came behind her. Half to distract herself, she spoke. "I'm Kendra, by the way. I'm going to take you somewhere safe." She paused, glancing back, but she could see little of his face to illuminate the silence. "What can I call you?" she asked, forced ease in her voice. For a long while there was no response as they continued to pick their way ploddingly through the dense, dark foliage. Then a muffled "Adrian," spoken into the coat. Though ill at ease, Kendra found to her surprise that she could not muster any fear of him. She had no explanation for the feeling of trust after all that she knew of the garden and all that she did not know of the boy, this Adrian. But as she walked and examined her thoughts and feelings, she found her certainty to be bone-deep and implicit. He felt so childlike. She was convinced that he could not be anything as dreadful as they would say. Nevertheless, well, she could hide him with Thomas. Progress was slow as she crept through the darkness. Now and then, stars shone through the branches, showing signs of her passage, lighting her way ever so slightly. She had never been much of a woodsman, and thought painfully back to the rambling scraps of information Boris had been passing along each evening. The lion's eye, brightest star of the southern sky, was apparently an excellent guide of direction, and she looked to it when she could, straightening the line of her travel as she found herself wending towards or away from it. She went as quick as she could. She could smell rain not far off. It took far longer to make her way back than it had to thunder into that clearing. The burning inspiration that had driven her before had cooled now, chilling the sweat of her exertions. The only warmth was that hand in hers. After some unknown time, heart leaping, she saw the glow of flames flicker between the trees. Looking back, she watched his newly illuminated face, glowing with anxiety. "It's all right," she assured him. "I'll take you somewhere safe, I promise. Just stay quiet." He did not seem convinced, mouth opening and closing in an agitated manner, strangely forlorn in the overlarge coat. Smiling in spite of herself, she pulled him into the camp. Eyes slowly adjusting to the light, Kendra registered activity near the fire, shadows passing back and forth before the glow of the flames. Low voices that she couldn't make out held what sounded like brief, urgent conversations. Her stomach lurched. Had her absence been noticed? She quickened her pace to where she knew Thomas's carriage to be, near the river. As she came to the wagon, she gave a start. Thomas sat at the entrance, the canvas flaps of the opening tossed wide around him. She hissed his name in alarm. As cold as it was, he was in no state to be out. She rushed to him, the hand slipping from hers. Thomas did not say a word as she came to his side, inspecting him urgently. His eyes tracked her dimly, strangely glassy and vacant. "Thomas!" she cried again, voice barely restrained. "What's going on?" He remained silent. He was looking past her, or through her. "You need to be resting. Get back inside." She took a hold of his arm and recoiled. It was cold and wet. He had to be drenched in sweat. She tried to lift him to his feet, to direct him back in, but it was like maneuvering a bag of sand. "Is that you?" he murmured, so quiet she could scarcely hear him. "Is it?" Behind her, she heard a squeak. Buried in her coat, her companion regarded the two of them with wide, black eyes. Face largely concealed, his expression, even in naught but moonlight, was clearly that of deepest terror. His gaze flicked around for an escape. "Adrian," she said soothingly, "this is Thomas, my friend. I'll have you staying in with him just as soon as—" She stopped. He was backing away now, head shaking convulsively. Then he turned and ran flat out. "Adrian, no!" she hissed urgently. Turning to follow, she jerked to a stop. Thomas held her hand firmly. Eyes still glazed, he wobbled dangerously, regarding her in an unfocused manner, as if he could not entirely remember how to operate his body. His large hand held her tightly, but he was still slick, and she twisted from his grasp. With a grunt, she flung herself after Adrian. His lean figure was already disappearing behind the brush when abruptly he was thrown to the ground. "Someone's here!" roared the voice of the firekeeper. Movement burst forth across the camp. 3 men in dark traveling cloaks converged on the site of the scuffle as Adrian squirmed beneath his captor, crying out in incoherent fear. Kendra saw Moira, fully dressed, striding between the wagons. With a lurch, she saw Moonlight gleam along the caravan mistress's naked blade. "Wait!" she yelled, waving her arms and running towards the scene. "Wait! He's with me!" A second later, and she was on the ground, leaves in her mouth. A figure she had not seen had kicked her legs out from under her and now pressed a knee into her back. Dazed, she struggled only weakly. Everything was dark, forest detritus wet with morning dew plastered across her face, caught in the mess of her tossed hair. Rapid paces made a crunching path through the leaves until a silver blade passed into her field of vision. "State your name," commanded Moira's icy knife of a voice from far above her head. Kendra froze as her heart throbbed violently, head rushing. For a moment, she thought the blade was already red with her blood, was still red with Lyra's. Her throat tightened, shrinking back, while breath came faster in tight, painful bursts. She might have slipped into panic entirely and had her throat cut then and there. But whimpers in the dark broke into her consciousness. Adrian was nearby, squirming beneath his captors, and without her to explain, Moira would. Kendra managed to swallow and coughed before finding her voice. Kendra Aberth." Her voice echoed hoarse and strange. The blade raised ever so slightly in Moira's tensely clenched fist, and she scrambled for more words. You call me Plum Blossom." The blade was perfectly still, then passed out of her vision. Then there was a hand in her hair and hot breath in her ear. "What the hell is going on here?" Moira's voice thrummed with fury and a note of something else. "We found your hammock empty, couldn't find you anywhere. Where have you been? What?" Moira yanked at Kendra's hair to direct her gaze to Adrian. "Did you bring into my camp?" As Kendra watched, other shapes began moving in the gloom. The whole of the camp seemed to be awake, and not merely from the ruckus. They had been watching in wait from the mouths of their wagons for some time. Weapons bristled from every corner. She recognized it now. The camp was in full defensive posture, and her mouth went dry. "This isn't about us," Kendra said slowly. "What happened?" She could not see the caravan mistress's face, but she felt some of the rigid poise slip from the figure at her back. There was a pause of several seconds. Then, in a blank, neutral voice, "Thomas is dead. Torn open, killed in his sleep. We never heard a scream." Another pause. Then the edge returned to her tone. "So given that you were unaccounted for, then came wandering in an hour later, you're going to have to start giving me some answers." Kendra blinked uncomprehendingly. The chill of the night sank down her throat and laid in her gut as the world seemed to grow distant from her. Her tongue felt oddly heavy in her mouth, and she swallowed hard several times before she could find the words. No, she mumbled croakily. "I saw him. I just saw him." Thomas's face swam hazily in her mind. He'd been just there a moment ago. Moira scoffed, and somewhere thunder rumbled. "And now he is dead. You can tuck someone in with a bedtime story and find them dead by dawn. There is no such thing as safe, not here. I have told you this time and again. So, what exactly is that?" Kendra shook her head, trying to give voice to her confusion. Thomas had been right there. She'd seen him. As she fumbled about with the words to her objection, a sharp blow to the face scattered her again. "Where did you find this boy?" Moira demanded, slow and clear. The metallic tang of her blood spread in her mouth as she blinked into the cold, dewy grass. The sensory assault was oddly focusing. "I found him," she said simply. "I heard crying out in the woods, and I found him, lost and alone. He needed my help." She blinked, gathering herself. "Moira, you've got it wrong. I just saw... Wait, what are you..." Moira had taken her knee out from between Kendra's shoulder blades and stood purposefully. Rapier at the ready, she began to walk to where the men held Adrian. Kendra scrambled painfully to her feet in pursuit. "What are you doing, ma'am?" she asked in alarm. "You've brought a threat into my camp. I'm dealing with it." "You can't!" Kendra blurted out, grabbing her shoulder. Moira, not having so much as spared a backwards glance, whirled on her now, eyes ablaze. "Can't? I can't!" Kendra took an involuntary step back as Moira turned heel and approached her, but the older woman quickly had her by the scuff of her shirt and held her. Even in the darkness, Kendra had to turn away from that gaze. The distant campfire flickered in her eyes with a ferocity that could not be dimmed as something of Moira's studied composure slipped. Yet when she spoke, the voice was still quiet and nearly level. "I will do whatever I have to protect my own. This caravan, everyone in it, even foolish greenhorns that cause more harm than good. You would do well to remember that." With a flick of her hand, she gave Kendra a dismissive shove and turned. Kendra held her arms close to herself, as small as she had ever been, as dozens of pairs of cold eyes skewered her through. Rooted to the spot, she looked on as the caravan mistress walked to where Adrian still lay beneath his captors, writhing and squawking. His eyes met hers from across the grove as his mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Those eyes, they reminded her of her sister's. But that could not be. She'd hardly known her sister, her mother, her father. They were long gone, all gone up in flames. She was brought to as the first drops of rain hit her, and she realized she was running. Moira's sword arm was raised, high silver still glinting in the failing firelight. Kendra tackled her squarely from behind, sending the sword flying, and the both of them sprawling to the ground. For several moments, every face was frozen in shock before an outburst of cries and commands came around her. Strong hands grabbed her from all sides, pulling her off the woman. The rapier spun away into shadowed undergrowth, and she was dimly aware that Moira was yelling, practically spitting with fury. From the edge of the circle, she saw Boris pushing his way towards her, looking haggard. She thought she might have bumped her head. It seemed she couldn't hear correctly. There was a dull rushing sound amid the discordant shouting. She looked between the angry, confused faces and shook her head. "Not him, too," she managed, dazed and raw. "Please, I can't stand it." But she was never certain if anyone had heard her, as all voices fell silent one final time. Moira was standing again, but she was not looking at Kendra. Her eyes looked past her, and Kendra watched as the color drained from her face. In their travels together, she had seen Moira dispatch drunks twice her size, navigate strange, winding paths not built by human hands, and direct the camp as a wolf pack howled around them. Somehow, she had never thought she might see fear in the caravan mistress's eyes. Moira tried to speak, failed, wet her lips. "Thomas?" A hitching, heaving sound filled the air behind Kendra, and the hands that held her up slackened. She fell to her knees. She could not think, could not speak. Most of all, she could not look behind her. As she knelt, she became aware that the sound was laughter, rasping like a cascade of sand, like the laughter of a year's dry riverbed. "Thomas?" asked the voice between its fits of mirth. "Thomas? Thomas?" It was raining in earnest now, raining hard, and her fingers were sinking into mud. A distant roaring was growing, folding into the laugh, but she lost that sound as the screaming began. She crouched, paralyzed, her mind blank with horror, and perhaps that was where it would have ended for her. Then she went crashing to the ground with a muffled scream, a weight pressing down on her. Kendra began to struggle when she heard Moira's voice in her ear. "Run, Plum Blossom!" she hissed, and Kendra obeyed. She scrambled forward on hands and knees to where Adrian lay, now petrified, staring fixedly in horror behind her. She grabbed him, hefted his frail, spindly form with manic energy, and began to run. She had made it no more than a few strides when a meaty blow struck her from behind, and she came crashing to the ground. A stray tree root stuck out, striking her knee, and she heard her clothing tear even as the limb went numb. She fell over Adrian, arms still surrounding him protectively. He was near motionless, trembling violently, hiding his face in his hands. She staggered back to her feet, sparing half a glance to the weight she shrugged off her back. The body fell limply to the ground, glinting redly in the moonlight. She could not be sure who it had been. The head was gone. When Kendra considered her fateful departure from the caravan in the days to come, those last minutes were recalled mostly as a blur. Grown men wept like children. Fire spread even as the river rose in a torrent, and everywhere she turned was awash with blood. All that was clear was Adrian's weight in her arms, heavy enough to stop her spiraling entirely into the haze of madness that had descended upon the camp. She could not say how, but eventually she found her flight had led her to the banks of the river, now a frothing white flood beneath the screeching gale. On the far side of the river lay the deepest groves of the witch woods. A figure at her back, silhouetted in flame, red hair whipping in the wind, approached her casually with the unconcerned gait of a hunter having cornered its prey. Kendra gathered all her strength, bound her hands tight around the frail form she carried, and flung herself into the churning water.